Hello there, you're watching the press preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So it's time to see what's making the headlines with the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire, and the columnist for the article, Ali Miraj. So a very good evening to both of you. And just to say that they will both be with us from now until just before midnight. So before we talk to them, let's take a quick look at what's making some of the front pages. And the Mirror leads with President Zelensky's surprise visit to the UK and his plea for the government to give Ukraine practical military support. Likewise, the Daily Telegraph quotes him saying, "Give us wings for freedom." And this same headline is on tomorrow's Times, while the Eye says the government is effectively looking to threaten Vladimir Putin with the possibility of British firepower. The Metro combines the names of our two countries to suggest unity. Thanks for the tea, now give me your jets is the headline on the front of The Sun as it references President Zelensky's address in Westminster Hall today. The Express looks at how former Prime Minister Boris Johnson is keen for the UK to send Ukraine all our jets. And the same story makes the front of the Daily Mail. Now, the Star isn't happy that some MPs want a £162,000 payment if they get voted out. And the FT has a story concerning the Indian conglomerate Adani Enterprises. And just a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. So let's bring in now Kevin Maguire and Ali Miraj and take you through some of those pages. And Kevin, let's kick off with your paper, with the Mirror here. The headline, "Give us your wings of freedom," paraphrasing President Zelensky's message in this surprise visit to the UK.
No, absolutely. Anna, planned for weeks but kept secret, and then it was announced just after 8 o'clock this morning. Only his second trip outside of Ukraine since the invasion a year ago this month. That was to the US. But no, it was a very powerful speech. He was warmly welcomed. And of course, he didn't just come to give thanks. As he always does, he makes a request, and this time it is for planes. And the government has ruled it out before, saying it isn't practical. Now it's going to look at it, but talking in terms of a long-term solution, which suggested some time off, because I suppose that the RAF's got about 30 F-35s, about 100 Eurofighter Typhoons. They cost about £100 million each. It's probably not just protecting those assets. If you're going to donate them, they require ground crews and incredible maintenance to keep them flying. So it is pretty tricky. It's not just like sending a car over to Ukraine. It is very complex. But Rishi Sunak is going to have to make a decision now. He couldn't just say no, so he says nothing's off the table. But it doesn't yet feel as if the jets are actually on the table.
Well, yes, that's interesting, isn't it, Ali? And let's take a look at the front page of the Eye, shall we? Because they say UK warns Putin, we may send fighter jets to protect Ukraine. But as Kevin was implying there, we didn't get a very clear answer, did we, from the Prime Minister? Nothing's off the table, but it's not clear whether or not those jets will go from the UK.
Well, Anna, what Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, following this visit from President Zelensky has done is he's asked Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, to investigate the issue now and come up with a potential plan to indeed send jets. I think there is a lot of pressure now. Zelensky gave a very, very emotive, well-delivered, impassioned speech, as he does. I mean, he's very good at PR in the media and getting his message across. He did the same thing a few weeks ago in Congress and got tanks on the back of it. And now we're talking about fighter jets. I mean, it's interesting because if you go back 6 months, there was a real reluctance on the part of NATO and Western nations to provide any offensive or be seen to provide offensive equipment at all, because they didn't want to be seen to be giving succor to the Russians to come back and say, well, you're getting involved in the war. Well, we've come a long way since then. It was only a few weeks ago that we were agonizing about whether to give tanks. Now we're considering whether to give planes. So we really have traveled a huge distance on that journey. The question I've still got is, what does success look like? And that is a question that no one yet has answered. Now, President Zelensky may have his own view, which is to push the Russians completely out of Crimea and out of all areas of the Donbass. That's his view, and he's entitled to do that. The question is, where are NATO on this? At the moment, they've left it to Zelensky to determine what he is comfortable with and what success looks like for him. But we are providing weapons here. So I do think that the West also has to have a view on how far it wants to go with this. You're dealing with a nuclear armed power here. This is very, very tricky and dangerous. And of course, we should support the Ukrainians. But we are now in a de facto war with everything being provided apart from boots on the ground. Now, some people say we should provide boots on the ground. That's always been resisted by NATO because they didn't want direct confrontation with Russia. But effectively, you are in a de facto creeping commitment here. And I think that that's something that has to be considered. The other thing that Sunak is under pressure on is funding for the armed services. Only this week, a lot of senior military personnel have said he needs to step up in the budget and backfill a lot of stuff that's gone to Ukraine and step up funding.
Well, yes, some questioning whether we have enough fighter jets anyway to provide. Military experts also suggesting that if you're going to provide tanks, you need the fighter jets to provide cover for them, or they're not going to be fully effective. And Kevin, before we move on from the eye, there's a photograph of Rishi Sunak with President Zelensky there on the front page. How important do you think this visit is for Rishi Sunak? I mean, we heard President Zelensky in that rather impressive address in Westminster Hall, acknowledging the work that Boris Johnson had done. But do you think Rishi Sunak is pleased to be seen, to be bonding, if you like, with the Ukrainian leader? Is he coming out of Boris Johnson's shadow on this issue?
Oh, I think absolutely. President Zelensky, one of the few world leaders, shorter also than Rishi Sunak. But no, absolutely. Now, Zelensky's not stupid. He's very clever. He plays the game brilliantly, and he will know the shots are now called by Sunak. Boris Johnson can exert pressure. He can go on his trips. He can now call for fighter planes. He can even propose that Ukraine join NATO. Didn't propose that when he was Prime Minister. And actually the European Union, which he wanted Britain out because it was undemocratic, but he thinks it's okay for Ukraine. He could do all that, but the power is now with Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister. And he's just very clever. He's very clever at his politics, Zelensky here. There's many Western countries, not all around the world, of course, because China, India, South Africa have not condemned the invasion, but certainly in the Western Europe, a lot of support for Zelensky, and he knows how to press the buttons to get that military aid. But I still think jets are way off just listening to the words. There's no way Sunak could say no, but he hasn't said yes.
Interesting, yes. And Ali, if we turn to the front page of The Sun, they focus on the meeting with the King today. Now give me your jets is their headline. But I'm quite interested by the fact that in the top right-hand corner, you've got the appeal that The Sun has launched for the earthquake victims, and we'll come on to talk about that. Do you think President Zelensky is mindful of the fact that people have given a lot towards Ukraine? He might be worried about compassion fatigue, and now there's a very big crisis in Turkey and Syria as well, and he wants to make sure that his message still cuts through.
Of course, and I think it was a very important visit that he made today, and he does know how to get his message across very effectively. His PR is second to none, and he gave a very powerful speech in Westminster Hall earlier in the day, and then he went to see the King, and I think the King gave him a very warm reception. King Charles is naturally very empathetic and sympathetic to the cause of the Ukrainian people, rightly so. And I think there was a real warmth between the two. And I think also President Zelensky spoke with great affection about King Charles when he had previously met him as well. So I think it was a big moment. And Zelensky is now also meeting Olaf Scholz and President Macron this evening in France ahead of meetings with EU leaders later this week. So it's not just weapons that he wants, but the bigger picture is he's also pressing for rapid extension into the EU within 2 years, which is really interesting. And it will be also interesting to see how Turkey reacts to that, being a NATO country. Zelensky also wants to be in NATO, how Turkey reacts to the fact that if the accession of Ukraine into the EU is accelerated, how Turkey will feel about that, because they've been courted for years, and it has to be seen to be a level playing field. So a lot of political dynamics yet to play out here.
Yes, indeed. And we touched on the earthquake there, and let's turn now to some of the coverage in the papers. Kevin, in the Mirror tomorrow, a double-page spread that you've picked out, the headline, "Get me out of here," and this extraordinary picture of a little girl, Mariam, who has been trapped under a collapsed building, but protecting her little brother with her arm. Really moving
36 hours.
photograph. It's those personal, very, those personal stories that really cut through in this appalling tragedy.
Yeah, and that's her brother there stroking his hair, and they were freed after 36 hours. They were in northern Syria because, of course, a lot of the coverage is focused on Turkey, but it's across the two countries, and the stories are heartbreaking. We've seen pictures of babies being taken out of the rubble alive, the newborn baby born in the rubble, the other babies, children killed. That picture of the man in the orange jacket holding the hand, you could just see the arm and the hand of his dead daughter who was still trapped. It just really hurts you when you see that. And of course, I was just watching your coverage earlier on. The period when you can rescue people has come into an end if they've been trapped and they haven't got and they're not protected from the cold, nothing to drink, nothing to eat. It's absolutely terrible. And yeah, compassion fatigue. There's been no sign of it yet. If people can't afford to donate, they shouldn't feel any shame, and if they can, good for them.
Well, yes, and Ali, there's so many aspects to this story, aren't there? The obviously horrendous personal tragedies is the main thing, but already questions being asked about whether enough's being done in terms of aid getting there in time, and in Turkey and in Syria, and whether or not the scale of destruction could have been avoided. There are so many issues that this throws up.
It's been absolutely horrific, and so many people have died. The estimate's now at 12,000. The World Health Organization is saying it could go up to 20,000. Absolutely appalling. The biggest tragedy since 1999, potentially, where about, I think, 18,000 died back then. And it is heartwarming, at least, to see some people being pulled out, but that's going to become increasingly difficult now because, as well as so many hours have elapsed since this earthquake took place, you also have a very cold environment now, -3 degrees temperatures out there. So it's going to be increasingly difficult now, and it's really, really horrific. And the politics of it are also quite difficult. You're right to mention that aid needs to get there as quickly as possible, but you've also got to mention the political backdrop to this is going to be very difficult for President Erdogan. He's got elections coming up in May. He's got 50% inflation before this happened, and he needs to be seen to actually respond to this huge natural disaster, and that's going to be very, very tricky for him, given the political and economic backdrop he faces.
Well, that's right. And he's dismissed the criticism of the operation, hasn't he? He said that the state was doing its job. He said it's not possible to prepare for disasters of this magnitude, although he did admit that there have been some difficulties with the initial response. But, Kevin, also lots of questions in Syria as well, because, there are areas that the government controls. There's area where lots of different groups control all around the border, and only one border crossing currently open.
No, absolutely. It's a fractured, broken state after 12 years of conflict. Assad, the dictator, is still there in Damascus, doesn't control the entire country, but it makes it a lot harder to get aid in, because the UK official aid budget was slashed by about $4 billion by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor. There's no deadline timetable yet to restore that cut. So Britain, like many countries, has pledged what is really a relatively small amount. But yeah, there are questions certainly for Assad and Erdogan in Turkey. But at the end of the day, they are Turks and Syrians. They're people who are dying, and they need our help. And to kind of cut across and forget the politics about it, it's what can we do?
Yes, indeed, and something obviously that the aid needs to get there quickly, doesn't it? The urgency is very apparent. Let's move on and see if we can get in a couple of other stories that are featuring in the papers as well, although those two obviously dominate the papers tomorrow. But let's turn to the front page of The Telegraph now, because their second story here politically correct, in inverted commas, prevent, focused on far right over Islamist terror. Ali, this is a focus. This is a review that was done into the Prevent programme, isn't it?
Yeah, there are two issues here. One is this is William Shawcross, who's done the review into the Prevent programme, which was designed to tackle Islamist extremism. That's where it started a number of years ago. It then moved on its remit to also tackle far-right extremism. And also the point that he's making in this report is that instead of, it does not focus sufficiently on non-violent extremism. And what it does is it treats people who go down the road of non-violent extremism as victims rather than as potential terrorists. And that's a serious problem. As someone who went to university in the mid-1990s and saw a bunch of Islamist extremist groups trying to infiltrate my university, the London School of Economics, and not succeeding because we told them to go packing. They were spouting bile and hatred back then. And this nonsense has been continuing for decades now. And the issue is, back then they weren't going around and getting on a conveyor belt to then commit terrorist atrocities. But we've had plenty of them. We've had the Manchester Arena bombing, 7/7, London Bridge attacks. So the problem here is it's not just the people who go and pick up knives or machetes or whatever they want to do to go and terrorize people. It's also people around who give succor to this kind of ideological, demagogic nonsense that these people spout. And that needs to be nipped in the bud.